Non-permanent members of the Security Council rotate monthly in the English alphabetic order. The role of the position includes approving the provisional agenda proposed by the Secretary-General and overseeing any crisis.
The UN Security Council President is authorized to issue both presidential statements, subject to consensus among Council members, and notes which are used to make declarations of intent. On Africa, the Security Council program for September details the DRC, Somalia, South Sudan and Western Sahara, but Southern Cameroonians are already appealing to Nikki Haley to look their way. A tweet replying to Haley's congratulations says the people of Southern Cameroon hope you will do justice to them and help salvage the double standards you have decried about the UN. #StopWarNow. During the US month, the Security Council is expected to discuss the UN stabilization mission in the DRC, MONUSCO, and the Secretary-General zero-tolerance policy on sexual violence following repeated allegations of cases of sexual abuse and exploitation by peacekeepers and civilian personnel in the DRC.
Here in the Security Council, we must hold those responsible for violence to account.
September is also the month that the UN Secretary-General is expected to report back on a resolution adopted in October 2017 to allow member states to inspect vessels suspected of smuggling migrants and human trafficking off the coast of Libya. Nikki Haley will have to balance U.S. bilateral issues, President Donald Trump's controversial tweets about world issues, and international security. Ntakwana Ngatani, SABC News.
To talk more on the implications of the chairing the UN Security Council, we are now joined by Professor Patrick Bond. Prof, thank you so much for joining us on The Globe. Now, how powerful is the United States within the Security Council?
Well, it has the veto, and it has especially financial power. It contributes the most, and it usually withholds its finances, especially for agencies it doesn't like. Human Rights Council, UNESCO, the cultural body. So it, for example, will play tough, and that means it'll get revenge within the UN if it doesn't like you. And as we know, Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador from Washington, doesn't like South Africa because South Africa is one of the countries that votes least tightly with the United States. So it could be a rough month, but particularly because of the election in the United States, where warmongering and sort of tough talk and maybe even sporadic battles could be expected ahead of the early November election to give Donald Trump a sort of patriotic sense. That's why I fear this month may be tough.
Now, you mentioned just off air the fact that Nikki Haley is one person to watch because more than likely she could be a possible candidate for presidency in the United States. Just take us through how, in terms of her as the UN ambassador from the US, how does she, in terms of her decision making and her process of thought with regards to pushing the agenda of the US on the UN Security Council?
Well, she's much more consistent than her president, Donald Trump. Her ideology can be called neoconservative. It's a tradition that came really from the Reagan and Bush, first Bush and then the second Bush era. And those guys are always intent on spreading democracy, which means they really are after oil or resources, and they use this ruse. She's quite good at that. She was a former governor of South Carolina, sort of provincial premier. And I would fear that in order to have a higher profile, so that if Donald Trump is indeed impeached, which is not out of the question because of all of his personal problems and his financial mistakes, and if Mike Pence isn't a popular president in replacement, she would be a logical candidate at the very top rung of the Republican Party and possibly could be president in early 2021 if she plays her cards right. So this is a political animal, whereas Donald Trump is a bit of a buffoon, isn't he? I mean, he's flip-flopping on everything. You can never really pin down an ideology. One day he's with Putin very tight, then the next the U.S. has tighter sanctions. The North Korean situation is in flux because Trump wanted to do the deal of the century with Kim Jong-un, but then now that seems to be going a little bit sour, and Trump has recently, with withdrawn a visit that Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, was supposed to make. In other words, it's very fluid. It's a very chaotic geopolitical situation.
Now, Prof, the U.S. is involved in some of the major conflicts that are taking place around the world. We touched on Turkey. We spoke of there's Israel, the issue you just mentioned, the DPRK, and not really knowing where that relationship is standing at the moment. Now, can the U.S. use this seat, even though it's a month-long period? A month is a very long time in terms of politics and decision-makings. Can they use this period to push their agenda or exert undue influence on the Security Council?
Yes, I mean, that would be the agenda for Nikki Haley, to portray tough leadership and to promote the kinds of particularistic struggles. They change all the time, but as you said, Turkey is one where Erdogan has rubbed Trump the wrong way by holding on to a U.S. preacher and keeping him in jail. It's a bit of a trivial matter, but it did lead Trump to impose sanctions. And we felt that today because we formally went into a recession and our currency dropped 3%. Yeah, that's because of this contagion, as it's called, in the emerging markets. And it goes from Turkey and then Argentina. And these were, quite loyal U.S. allies. But when Erdogan gets the sanctions, the lira drops, the interest rates go up, and suddenly this little cold becomes pneumonia for South Africa. We may be the next in the queue to kind of be an emerging market that submerges. And that's really Donald Trump's frivolous character. There are more dangerous sites, Syria, where maybe 500,000 people have been killed. Now, it seems that Trump is beginning to pull back and leave the space for the Russians. But, there are 6 sites around the world. Ukraine, there are tensions on the India-China border. There's a South China Sea. There's no hot war aside from Syria, but there's a lot of embers that could be blown into a war if Nikki Haley feels that the U.S. agenda, especially with Israel and Iran, that's one of the hot spots because of, again, sanctions and an alleged breach of the deal that Obama had cut with the Iranians. So we're going to be caught in that as well because there'll be pressure on us not to buy Iranian oil. These are areas where I'd hope for a very strong reaction to U.S. meddling, U.S. imperialism.
Now, just speaking of, U.S. meddling and U.S. imperialism, it's America first, and this agenda is most likely to come through, as you mentioned, on the U.S. sea. Security, in terms of the international oversight body, does it have enough power, just considering the fact that the U.S. also has veto powers? Can the Security Council be able to pull back and make sure that a decision is not final if they're not comfortable or not happy with it? A decision by the UNSC is binding. The members, the permanent members and the non-permanent members, can they pull back on a decision or withdraw a decision that is taken by the U.S.?
Well, it's such a balance of forces that remains untested, and it's partly because we probably won't see this month a major conflagration that would entail a veto opportunity. Usually the vetoes are made by the U.S. on General Assembly resolutions that deal with any kind of criticism of Israel. They're absolutely dogmatic in supporting the Zionist project. So that would be one problem. I would say, though, there's a more difficult terrain where the Security Council just doesn't operate very effectively to solve problems around the world. They can put peacekeepers here. But you might remember the last time they took a strong stand against the U.S. and its war agenda was in 2003 when the U.S. and the U.K. led the coalition of the willing to invade Iraq. And they couldn't get that through the Security Council or the General Assembly. It didn't stop them, they just went ahead anyway. And shortly thereafter, the General Assembly said, okay, you can control Iraq now, you broke it, it's yours. I think this is why the UN hasn't really worked very well. None of the multilaterals have really solved our world problems. And now maybe Trump will pull out of the WTO. Last year he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and I suppose I'm continuing naively hoping, like 5 weeks ago here in Johannesburg, that someone will stand up. We had a chance with the BRICS, but they didn't do anything particular. There was an attempt by Xi Jinping to get a trade coalition together to fight Trump on his protectionism. Hasn't materialized. The next opportunity comes in December in Buenos Aires for the G20, but that's going to be a difficult time because Argentina's in big trouble and there's lots of anger in the streets about that. I suspect that until a major event occurs, like the U.S. declaring war, the needed sanctions against the U.S., maybe a climate sanctions using a carbon tax, will be slow. It'll have to really come from popular movements, the way the anti-apartheid movement emerged, with popular movements, because governments just weren't willing to act.
This is a big world power that you know, as you mentioned, that a lot of there was a lot of hope with regards to the BRICS taking a stance, and that didn't materialize, and now there's hope that it might happen in December with the G20 summit. This is America that we're talking about, a first world power. Do you think it's even a possibility?
Well, let's just take that particular configuration where the BRICS have Russia and China pretty much definitely up against the US and sanctions and the trade war. But India has been pro-Washington, very tight, even militarily, and also connecting to Israel. And the Brazilian president, the coup president, Temer, has been tight with Washington, was part of, as WikiLeaks showed, part of the sort of surveillance system that the US used. That means we've got really a split BRICS when it comes to the UN Security Council. Everyone had hoped that with enough pressure, Russia and China could bring the South Africans, maybe Nigerians, plus Brazil, plus India, maybe Germany and Japan, into the UN Security Council as permanent veto-wielding members. But there's no hope, frankly, because Russia and China don't want to dilute their own power. So we're really looking at a sort of a muddle, you know, a real an inability to break through there. And I don't think anything much will happen this month, except for Nikki Haley kind of using it as a bit of a bandstand. I mean, the danger is, again, with the election coming, that Trump may have some little war ready to go to, you know, rally his troops and get patriotism up so he doesn't lose the United States House of Representatives, half of his Congress. And that may well happen in early November unless he does something dramatic. It looks like the major danger is the weeks before an election. They sometimes call it the October surprise, but Nikki Haley may be preparing the ground for it this month in the Security Council.
Now, South Africa will be on the UNSC from January next year, which is 2019. With regards to that, do you think they can influence any decision-making with regards to the US and maybe even sanctions, or even bring the BRICS members together and, you know, with China and Russia eventually having to dilute their power stance in terms of their veto and permanent seats?
Well, that would be ideal, and if South Africa continued, say, a tradition that had been begun partially with Thabo Mbeki, or if you remember, the late Nelson Mandela was so eloquent when he said, as George W. Bush prepared war in Iraq, that President George Bush does not have a brain. Now that's the spirit I think the world would like to see from South Africa after Donald Trump made this ridiculous fibbing tweet recently that we're witnessing in South Africa widespread murders of white farmers. And this was disproven, and the people who put him up to it, Afro Forum and the right wing in the US, I think they're standing exposed as huckstering him. But the fact that he made that tweet reflects that he's got a far right-wing base that he's trying to stir up and remind that, yeah, they've got to come out and make sure that he doesn't lose this election, he doesn't lose his Congress. He's not up for election again until 2020. The main thing, though, is he's got this pressure of his personal life, his finances, that makes him very exposed. And his major strategy as a result, distract attention. Let's hope that doesn't mean starting a war.
Prof, we'll have to leave it there for now.
Thanks,
Thank you so much for joining us. And that was Professor Patrick Bond joining us live in studio. Time now for a quick break.